Professor Abba Brown, and the class is Confronting Oppression and Injustice. I will be discussing the critical concept of bias. It's very important in anti-oppressive practice that we consider the role of bias, and not so much that we set a goal to get rid of bias, but rather that we find ways to recognize that bias is a part of each one of our lives, not just for those in society or those that we are going to be working with, but also for ourselves. This draws on the importance of engaging in self-reflexive practice in order to be an anti-oppressive practitioner. Bias is something that occurs very early in our lives, and research suggests that by middle childhood, we have formed most of our conscious biases and all of our unconscious bias. What this means is that since the time we were babies, we have been learning how to believe certain things were good and believe certain things were bad. Bias serves a very natural and evolutionary purpose. For example, centuries ago, if I saw a tiger, or even now, the bias that I have against that tiger would be to run away from the tiger. So bias oftentimes is linked to our own sense of survival. This is important to note because we will engage with bias as practitioners and the biases that we see in our clients. So bias, as is defined, is an inclination of temperament or outlook and a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment. Again, the goal of an anti-oppressive practitioner is not to eliminate bias. That is an unrealistic goal. However, the goal that we should have consists of 4 concepts. 1, recognizing bias. An anti-oppressive practitioner becomes very, very tuned in to when bias is entering a situation where they are working in their professional capacity. If you're sitting across from a client, you're dealing with a community, you're advocating with a legislator, it is the imperative of an anti-oppressive practitioner to recognize when bias has entered your thinking. The second piece of that is to acknowledge the bias. We know from much of our training that those things that we do not acknowledge don't just go away because we ignore them. They fester and they grow, whether it be in ourselves interpersonally or whether it be in communities and or society. So first we must recognize the bias. Second, we must acknowledge it. The third, and this is critically important for the anti-oppressive practitioner, is to manage bias. Oftentimes, if you recognize bias and you are engaged with a client, you can't excuse yourself to find a way to get rid of what you were just thinking. But you must recognize, acknowledge, and then manage. And so we will talk in anti-oppressive practice about strategies for you to manage your bias. And the fourth component is to understand. Now, we don't always have the luxury of time to really delve into understanding why we are biased when we are engaged in social work practice. However, it is imperative that the first moment that you have, once you have recognized a bias, acknowledged it, and managed it through the work that you're doing, is to understand it. This is part of the self-reflexive practice, again, that is required of anti-oppressive practitioners.